Who is here because they're a fan of C.S. Lewis? Good, couple of hands. Who's here because they're a fan of J.R.R. Tolkien? Also a good mix. Who's here because they're my father and feeling super supportive? and who's here just because they want to learn a little bit of Torah? All right. Amazing. I'm glad to see you for whatever reason you're here. And I want to start with a little bit of a question. Now that I've shared my joy at seeing you, I want to rewind just a little bit. Why are you here today? And the answer for some of you is, Rabbanit Liz, you told me to come here because it's part of school. And why do you think we're here talking about Tanakh? Because we could theoretically be having a Yomei Iyun on Talmud or on the laws of the Yamim Noraim or any of the other things that are important, are part of Judaism, are part of what we do. But we're here having a Yomei Iyun about Tanakh, and we're here to learn Tanakh. Yeah?
Just a guess, just a hunch, because I've been around a little longer than some of you, is that classically, people who learned, men who learned, they, let us say politely, neglected Tanakh. And I think part of YCT's original thing is to bring back Tanakh. And in fact, I suppose you could maybe get off on something about how well women study Tanakh and guys don't, because guys are studying the important stuff. But there might be an element of that, I'm guessing.
Right. So one possibility is because Tanakh is neglected, so we kind of need to bring it back. And why else? Why do you study Tanakh? Why is it important to you? Yeah? See like people hesitantly raising hands? Yeah, go ahead.
At some point, I got the idea that I need to finish Tanakh, and also when I learn Talmud, they'll just offhand quote Iyov and have a full understanding of it, and I should know this if I'm going to try to read the second Nazir.
Yeah. So it's pretty clear that the rabbis who we learn in Talmud, who are writing our halacha, have an extraordinary knowledge of Tanakh themselves, especially from an era where books were really expensive and people probably didn't have them. So if Tanakh was sort of encyclopedic for them, I mean, maybe it doesn't need to be as encyclopedic for us. We have smartphones, we have affordable books. We don't need to know it sort of by heart quite the same way, but we should know it. We should have familiarity with it. Any other reasons? Yeah?
It's the foundational text of our religion. And even though you might say that the Gemara is not the foundational text, it's the way we act day to day, it's a practical matter in terms of hashkafa and how we're supposed to act. We still hark back to Tanakh.
Right. So Tanakh is sort of the cornerstone. Even if it expands out into the Gemara, the thing that we come back to, the thing that we return to, the thing that we do every year. Not everyone does Daf Yomi, but everyone reads Torah. People who would never consider Daf Yomi are like, yeah, 929, it's great. Let's read a parak of Tanakh a day. This is amazing. Let's get into this. Let's return to this text. There's another way to ask this question, which Rashi asks at the beginning of literally of Bereshit. He asks the obvious question of why did we start with Bereshit? Why didn't we start with the first mitzvah in the Torah, which is Rosh Chodesh? Like just skip all of the really good stories up through halfway through Yetziat Mitzrayim and just start there by telling people HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem, this month shall be for you. And the reason Rashi gives is because if you don't have the backstory, then you can't argue for sort of why we have a right to all of the things that we have a right to. That we can say God created the heavens and the earth, so God was the one who gave you the land of Israel in the first place, so God can then give it to us. That's Rashi's justification for why we don't start that way. And there's a part of me reading that and that thinks like, what kind of hava amina, what kind of ideas in the back of your head where you're like, oh, you need to justify the story bits. You need to justify the existence of the narratives that give us Joseph and Abraham and Noah and the Migdal Bavel and all of these like really great things that deeply caught my attention as a child. You're telling me that that's the part that needs to be justified? Justify Vayikra. That's the part that's boring. Don't tell me why we need the interesting stories. And yet, I think that Rashi kind of makes a point. And it's one that it's worth noticing and paying attention to, that the stories themselves are not necessarily the things that define our day-to-day lives. That when we wake up in the morning, when we think about sort of the halachot, the laws that define what it means to be an observant Jew, it's not usually Avraham Avinu. It's not most of the time, except like twice a day, Yetziat Mitzrayim. It's not the fact that we got taken out of Egypt. Most of the time, where can I eat? When is it going to be Shabbat? How many days of Yom Tov are coming up, and why do we have so many more than are in Israel, are not really defined by the parts of Torah that kind of speak to us. And having said that, I think that what I want to do is get a little bit back into the mindset of why these stories are important as stories, not as justifications, not as places for the Midrash to extrapolate, not as sort of places for the Gemara to hang ideas on, but as stories in and of themselves, that we can be better readers of Tanakh, more sort of religious, thoughtful, interested Jews by focusing on these stories in Tanakh and understanding what they can do for us. And I think we can do that by reading two Christians. In particular, two men at Oxford and eventually Cambridge for C.S. Lewis, in the middle of the 20th century, who were very, very thoughtful about their own faith. So, good, I did steal one for myself. Perfect. All right, so I'm going to do the thing that people should never do when it comes to Tolkien. I'm going to read his poetry out loud. And I'm also going to note, for those who are wondering, that Tolkien himself said that when he was younger and he was reading myths, he always skipped the poetry. So he too, even Tolkien, had his moments of like, this is too much poem, I'm going to skip it. So first of all, justify every single one of you who has ever skipped a poem in Tolkien. And also, now that I'm a little bit older and can appreciate poetry a little bit better, I'm going to read what is probably one of my favorite pieces that he ever wrote. The heart of man is not compound of lies, but draws some wisdom from the only wise, and still recalls him. Though now long estranged, man is not wholly lost nor wholly changed. Disgraced he may be, yet is not dethroned, and keeps the rags of lordship one he owned. His world dominion by creative act, not his to worship the great artifact. Man, sub-creator, the refracted light through whom is splintered from a single white to many hues, and endlessly combined in living shapes that move from mind to mind. Though all the crannies of the world we filled with elves and goblins, though we dared to build gods and their houses out of darkened light and sow the seeds of dragons, 'twas our right used or misused. The right has not decayed. We make still by the law in which we're made. What Tolkien is doing here is basically arguing that when we tell stories, we are at our most godly. That is when we are in imitatio Dei. When we are godlike, when we are creating secondary worlds, we are in our own way doing what God does in creating the primary world. The stories that we tell, and it's our right to tell them, and it's our right to tell them in the most fantastic and fairy-esque possibilities, because what we're doing then is a little spark of the divine. We are being godlike. We are sort of walking in Hashem's footsteps, though he wouldn't use that language, when we sit and tell and listen to stories. So that's the framework that I want to start by opening with, I guess. This possibility that the story part of Tanakh is not just the justification for halakha or the places to hang laws. It's actually in and of itself a deeply critical part of what it means to be human beings made in the image of God, B'Tselem Elokim. And then I want to do a little bit of close reading of different passages, first from Lewis, then from Tolkien, to look at how they, in their own way, got at what they're trying to do with stories. And I'm hoping that looking at what they do, we can then take that into the Yamim Noraim and look at specifically the Torah reading and the Haftorah reading over the next sort of arc of Tishrei, and think about what are these stories doing for us as stories, not as things that have an inherent moral or message, not as allegories that are meant to represent something but are not themselves important, but as like real, what Tolkien would call true myths that speak to the soul. All right, so let's start with C.S. Lewis. I think because I'm the one with the mic, I'm going to be the one doing the reading, which is not my favorite approach. And also, I think we're just going to have to ride with it today. So C.S. Lewis has his own interesting kind of story. He turned atheist somewhat early in life. He writes about all of this in his autobiography, and struggled with God, and in particular was one of those atheists who was really, really angry at a God who he didn't believe existed.
Oh, yeah.
And it's also really important to remember that Lewis and Tolkien both went through World War I, what they would have felt as the Great War. And it was traumatic for Tolkien, who was in the trenches for a while. It was traumatic for Lewis. Yeah?
Well, Lewis also got wounded.
Lewis was wounded.
Lewis lost his mother when he was very young.
Both Lewis and Tolkien lost their mothers when they were young. They were both wounded. They both had like really traumatic experiences. Tolkien was always religious, so he's sort of our from birth person, and Lewis is our Baal Tshuva. Thanks in part to Tolkien. I love having all the history buffs in the room with me. It's so good.
Just the C.S. Lewis geek.
Yeah. So for Lewis, a lot of it is coming back to and figuring out for himself what it is to have a relationship with God, what it is to believe in a particular God. For him, it's also what it is to believe in Jesus, which we're not going to spend a lot of time on because obviously we're here. But when he writes, when he tells stories, he's coming at it from the perspective of somebody who spent a lot of time justifying to himself his own religiousness, and his own religiousness in the face of his reading of science fiction and fantasy and Greek and Norse mythology and studying classics and studying English literature. You can see why I relate to him if you know me particularly well.
Ask you a question. You have
Yeah.
page numbers here. What books of Lewis's are you referring to? Page 63 of what book?
Oh, all the quotes are from On Stories and other essays on literature.
Oh, okay.
So citation, I think, is at the bottom. So when Lewis is writing and he's telling these stories, then he's thinking of it from this perspective of like, how am I justifying this thing? The genre usually known as apologetics. So this is perhaps why I sometimes lean a little bit towards Tolkien. Lewis is always sort of assuming that his reader is arguing with him and that he needs to justify sort of the way he is and the way the status quo is. And Tolkien, for all his faults, never apologized for anything, ever. I like the more strident tone. I like the way that he kind of comes out swinging of, let me tell you why this is amazing, as opposed to Lewis, who kind of comes in with like, I see why you might have problems, let me help you with them. Some of this may also be my own bias as somebody who heard a lot of apologetics as a child and still doesn't like them. So when he talks, he comes at it as, I understand you might have some objections, but let me come at them. And this is kind of what he's doing here. So, quote A, for we have been told on high authority that in the moral sphere, children are probably at least as wise as we. Anyone who can write a children's story without a moral had better do so. That is, if he's going to write children's stories at all. The only moral that is of any value is that which arises inevitable from the whole cast of the author's mind. So I think what Lewis is saying here, and this is a thing to think about when we go to Tanakh, is the purpose of the story is not to teach a particular moral. The story doesn't exist to create a moral. The moral arises out of the broadness of the story itself. In this case, sort of out of the mind of Tanakh, out of the Torah. You get a sense of this is the particular morality that is inherent in the stories. But in some ways, it's overcomplicated to look at it on a very surface level of all good things happen to good people, and the way that we know that this person is good is that good things happen to them, which would, for one thing, call into question the story of Yaakov and Esav, where obviously the moral is steal from your siblings and it'll go great for you.
Oh, yeah.
That's not what we want to teach. That's not what we believe in. So what you end up with is a story that is more complex than a single moral, but like morality arises out of it. And I think that's what Lewis wanted to do with his own writing, but I think that it's what he really believes writing ought to be doing. There's a quote that I don't have in front of me, but where he says that authors shouldn't be a spectacle to look at, but spectacles to see through. And that's what he really wants. Like, he wants you to kind of come to things through writing, not for the writing itself to shine. When he talks about writing the Chronicles of Narnia, I'm just gonna skip through like most of this. He basically says that if you tell kids what to do, they won't like it. But if you can show them, if you can bring them to it a little bit past that, then it's good. So this is like halfway through. An obligation to feel can freeze feelings, and reverence itself did harm. When you tell people how they need to feel, they stop being able to feel it. The whole subject, in this case Christianity, was associated with lowered voices, almost as if it were something medical. But supposing that casting all these things into an imaginary world, stripping them of their stained glass and Sunday school associations, one could make them for the first time appear in their real potency. Could one not thus steal past those watchful dragons? I thought one could. And that's what he thinks he's doing. That when he tells his stories, he's sneaking past the feelings that we tell people to feel to let them actually feel those feelings and then bring it back to the real world. He also talks about allegory, and in particular, he complains about Christians interpreting Tanakh allegorically. He basically says that, like, if you try to just turn it into a story where it's a one-to-one correspondence of meaning, where, like, this represents this, and this represents this, and it never is anything more than that, you miss the entire thrust and power of the mythos. And he says, of course you can allegorize it. You can allegorize anything, whether in art or real life. I think we should here take a hint from the lawyers. A man is not to be tried at the assizes, I actually don't know how to pronounce that word, until there had been shown a prima facie case against him. We ought not to proceed to allegorize any work until we have plainly set out the reasons for regarding it as allegory at all. Don't look at something and say, oh, here's what it must represent. Tolkien was also famously against allegory, mostly because people would say things like, the Lord of the Rings is an allegory for the Cold War. And Tolkien's like, no, it's not. That's not what I did. What?
Do you mean the Cold War?
Yeah, people would say that.
He was around at that time.
No,
He was still around, but
which of course makes absolutely no sense because it was written before the Cold War. And yet it came out in the US sort of in the middle of the 1960s. And a lot of people were like, oh, the ring is the atom bomb and Mordor is Russia. And Tolkien's like, what are you talking about? There's also we're going to get into like book history here, but like there's a lot of issues with Tolkien's works where they were pirated in the US a ton.
oh yeah.
Because getting the rights was annoying and it was expensive, so people would just publish pirated copies. So nobody really had any idea when it was published, what was going on with it. There were a bunch of hippies running around reading it who loved it, and Tolkien was like, this is not, the Ace paperbacks with the weird covers, some of which I've seen because they're my mom's original copies. So there are all these feelings associated with the text that Tolkien's like, this is not what I'm doing, which is, I think, part of where Lewis gets his sense of over-allegorizing is bad, and stories sometimes speak beyond what the author thinks they're going to say. Stories jump and go further and leap off the page and speak to us in ways that are unanticipated. And I think that if we make it an allegory, we shut down what it can do. But if we allow it to sort of speak and jump off the page and come alive for us, then it can have statements that are relevant for us in the future, even without sort of necessarily needing to mean it. Yeah.
So that makes sense to me for literature that's written by people. Do you think that understanding changes when there's a divine author, or maybe like all the more so there should be even more multiplicity and potential of meaning?
So the question is there the idea of bringing meaning down or saying it's allegory works for a human author, and sort of the idea of a text that exceeds its author's limits. The question for sort of a divine author capital A, and a text is a little more complicated. And I think the principle of shivim panim laTorah does exist, that like you can read it as an allegory, or like if it's an allegory, perhaps it would mean this, but then because allegory is so limiting, I think it's a little bit more of an invitation to say, it could represent this and it speaks to this particular emotional experience, and also it's doing all of these other things. I think it's a little easier in some ways when you're dealing with a divine author because you can say sort of God means everything at the same time in a way that a human being can't. Kind of the idea of shamor v'zachor b'dibur echad, like if God can say two things at the same time, God can say two things in a text at the same time, God can say way more things than that. And I think that even human beings, like part of the magic of writing is that it gives us the opportunity to say shamor v'zachor b'dibur echad. We can say two not entirely the same things at the same time in a text when we write it.
But also the stakes are higher. Let's say like, okay, Lord of the Rings is actually an allegory of the Cold War. okay, like that feels off, but fine. But like if you read a Torah text and say something that's off, like that's very different. So I guess it's also then like, how do you contain and make shivim panim velo shivim brachot? Like
Exactly.
That's the issue. I feel like it's
Right.
it's hard.
So when you're dealing with Torah, it's in some ways more about what gives you the right to read it this way, and how do you make sure that you're reading it correctly. And I mean, I think that that's sort of a problem no matter what.
Author's attention feels more scary.
Right. Well, there's no such thing as death of the author when the author is sort of kel melech chai v'kayam. It's just a little bit more difficult to think that way. And I also think that when you're dealing with an infinite being, it's also perhaps possible to think in terms of infinite possibilities. And what you're sort of beholden to is, I would think, the text and the context. When we think sort of pshat, remez, drash, sod, like the multiple levels of reading of sort of the surface level, the contextual level, the sort of broader level, the secret levels, all of those things, they're still sort of one giant web of stories. So it is possible to say, this is not a reading of the text that makes sense given everything we know. And I also think that that just means that we have a responsibility in the same way that we have, like, part of being in a covenant is that sort of bidirectional responsibility to God from us and responsibility from God to us, that like we have responsibility to be good caretakers of the Torah. And I mean, if we knew what that meant, we wouldn't be here. Part of why we're here, I think, is that we get to have these conversations and think about what it means to be good stewards. And part of what I think that Tolkien and Lewis are offering us is an expansion of being good stewards to like appreciating it as a story that is itself meaningful and not just as a thing that teaches something. Be like where the story is the sorry for the metaphor. The story is the cheese that you wrap the dog pill in to get the dog to eat it. Like I don't think Tanakh is that for us. I think it's more it needs to be meaningful in and of itself. Is basically what I think they're offering. One final quote from Lewis where he's talking, and this is probably the most helpful for me because it frames the kind of Torah cycle in a really helpful way. The rereader is not looking for actual surprises, which can come only once, but for a certain surprisingness. We do not enjoy a story fully at the first reading. Not till the curiosity, the sheer narrative lust, has been given its sop and laid asleep, are we at leisure to savor the real beauties. Till then, it is like wasting great wine on a ravenous natural thirst which merely wants cold wetness. The children understand this well when they ask for the same story over and over again. Apparently he's in my house. And in the same words. They want to have again the surprise of discovering that what seems Little Red Riding Hood's grandmother is really the wolf. It is better when you know it is coming. Free from the shock of actual surprise, you can attend better to the intrinsic surprisingness of the peripeteia. Basically, it's one thing to find out for the first time that Joseph has framed Benjamin and he's going to go to jail, and if the brothers will just let him leave, then everything will be fine. But then they lose Benjamin, and Judah breaks the promise that he made to his father. And then first of all, the Torah stops there, and you have to wait until the next week to get to Vayigash Yehuda and get to Judah going and confronting him. And then the second time it happens, when you know what's coming the next week and you know how the story is going to go, it is so much better, so much richer. You see the clues, you see the way that it's building and building, and you know that it's building towards something. It's not just leaving you as a cliffhanger, it's really bringing you into the text and inviting you to delve more deeply into it as a story. And I think that I also think that there's something very thoughtful about the way that we kind of design Torah reading, that it accounts for, we want this to be a story. We want this to be a well-told story. We want this to have cliffhangers at the end of what functions as chapters for us. And that's like a part of it. And if it was just about sort of the message, then you wouldn't put in a cliffhanger, because a cliffhanger is precisely what breaks the message in the middle. But if it's about the story, if it's about the experience of reading it and living it and thinking of it as a true myth, then the reread and the cliffhanger and the going back and having it again and again becomes an integral part of the experience and of seeing kind of what is the myth of the found brother and what is kind of that moment where we go from all being lost to everything being saved, which Tolkien will get us back to. So that's Lewis's sort of framework. He's thinking in terms of how do we write good stories that are moral in nature without being obnoxious moral tales? How do we write stories that sort of resonate again and again and again, which makes sense from someone who left Christianity and came back to it? What does it mean to come back to God? Hashivenu Hashem elecha v'nashuva. Return us to you and we will return. Lewis is kind of functioning in that space. He's thinking about what does it mean to come back again and again. And I think in Elul, so are we. And then we get to Tolkien, who, as was previously noted, is kind of the reason that Lewis ended up being Christian. Tolkien was mad because Tolkien was like a dyed-in-the-wool Catholic, and Lewis stayed a Protestant, which makes sense as someone from Ulster. There's a lot of like Christian politics going on here, where here are the Catholics and here are the Protestants, and here they really don't get along. So there's really no way, given his yichus, that Lewis would have ever ended up a Catholic. And Tolkien was still kind of mad about it. But yeah.
Now, just as an interesting side note, some years ago, a Catholic priest wrote a whole book laying out his theory as if Lewis had just lived a little bit longer, he would have come back to Rome. I was not convinced. But
yeah.
Tried hard.
Lewis, interesting.
Not come to.
Find it.
No way.
Yeah. There's always this need, I think, and I think we see it in these authors as well, and it's something that is worth accounting for and noticing, even if it doesn't make them not worth reading, that everyone has their own bias, that the particular way of being a religious person that they have come to is the one that is manifestly proven and the one that makes the most sense. And obviously it's this, and obviously it's that. And like when Lewis is writing apologetics, it's like, here's the reason that obviously Christianity is true. And from the inside, it makes perfect sense. And from the outside, you're like, you have not made an argument that argues for your religion as opposed to mine. And it's real, and I think in many ways, part of the problem of any kiruv work is that you're always kind of making an argument that's like, my way is more right than anyone else's. And Lewis, part of the reason I think he moves away from apologetics as he gets older in life is that he understands that part of that draws people to religion is the experience of seeing God or feeling God or those moments where you're touched by the divine. And there's nothing any person can say that can really bring you to that. There is a possibility that somebody can give you the framework to understand it, but at the end of the day, sort of religious mystical experiences are things that happen to you, whether they happen through texts, whether they happen through moments, whether they happen through, for us, it might happen through tefillah, it might happen through learning. I am not a huge tefillah person, so for me it usually happens with like really good chavrutot. Feel like there's more than me there. There's like the moment of being touched by the divine and understanding something that you couldn't have understood on your own. But like me and the person I'm learning with and God are all learning together and then we get it. So like that's my sort of divine experience. But when everyone has their own and you can't really give it to someone, what you can do is give people the framework and the understanding and the story to make sense of it. And this is where Tolkien comes in. Tolkien would say that what you can give people is you can give people that experience in a story so that when it happens to them in the real world, what he calls the primary world, they recognize it. So if you know what it feels like to have that moment of salvation and beauty and wonder from reading a book, then you know what it feels like to run into it in the real world. You can find it again. If you can find it in Tanakh, then you can find it today. If you can find those moments then, you can find them now. And that's what Tolkien argues is sort of the real reason that fantasy literature and fairy stories exist. So all of the quotes from Tolkien I stole from On Fairy Stories, which is basically one of my favorite essays by him. And he talks about first the idea of enchantment in fantasy, which I don't want to call Tanakh fantasy because fantasy means a very particular thing, and Tanakh isn't that. And also, I think the idea of thinking of God as sort of one step back from us, where we are authors in the primary world who create a fantastical secondary world, and that we invite people into. And God is the author of the primary world who creates this primary world that invites us into it. It's like sort of, imagine if reality was also fantasy. I think is kind of what he's trying to get to, and I'm not entirely sure that he succeeds. It's a way of thinking that he's kind of testing out on his audience in an essay that he does multiple times, which was a lot easier to do when every lecture you do isn't recorded and people didn't listen to it 20 times. But I digress. So he says, Art is the human process that produces, by the way, it is not its only or ultimate object, secondary belief. Art of the same sort, if more skilled and effortless, the elves can also use, or so the reports seem to show. But the more potent and specially elven craft I will, for lack of a less debatable word, call enchantment. Enchantment produces a secondary world into which both designer and spectator can enter, to the satisfaction of their senses while they are inside, but in its purity and its artistic desire and purpose. To the elvish craft enchantment, fantasy aspires, and when it is successful, of all forms of human art most nearly approaches. At the heart of many man-made stories of the elves lie, open or concealed, pure or alloyed, the desire for a living, realized, sub-creative art. That the fairy stories that we tell, according to Tolkien, are our attempt to create worlds and invite other people into them. Okay, which I think, I'm trying to figure out a good way to say this, because what I think Tolkien wants us to think about from this perspective is thinking of Tanakh as a view of the primary world that is telling us something between a true myth and a fairy story of the world is like this. Believe, what does it mean to be in here? What does it mean to be a part of this? What does it mean to do this and live in it and love it and find it beautiful? And then he gives the reasons, and this is actually sort of where I think he shines, that one would end up in fantasy, why one would want to embrace this idea of a secondary world. What can fantasy do for the reader that is so compelling? And he basically says there are three things. I left one out because there weren't any good quotes. So the first is recovery. The fantastic elements in verse and prose of other kinds, even when only decorative or occasional, help in this release, but not so thoroughly as a fairy story, a thing built on or about fantasy, of which fantasy is the core. Fantasy is made out of the primary world, but a good craftsman loves his material and has a knowledge and feeling for clay, stone, and wood, which only the art of making can give. By the forging of Graham, cold iron was revealed. By the making of Pegasus, horses were ennobled. In the trees of the sun and the moon, root and stock, bower and fruit are manifested in glory. When we look at things in fantasy and they become new and beautiful to us, we then see them again in the real world. So sort of the trees of fantasy make us look at trees differently. The sun and the moon of fantasy make us look at the world anew. The belief, the stories that we experience in fantasy, the romances, the family relationships, the struggle between good and evil, when we read them in fantasy, then we can come back to the real world and see them again and afresh and be less tired. This is what he calls recovery. The idea that when we stop being so stuck in the real world and can look at it from the outside, we can come back and find the real world beautiful again. Yeah?
I'm curious, this meaning in a different way of, in some sense, is like, I'm thinking about like Heschel and Tefillah, or like there. I think Judaism has lots of different ways that we try to access this feeling that isn't actually learning, but is in some sense learning Torah, or learning Tanakh.
Yeah.
In some sense, that's what like prayer and brachot are for.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. That ideally, when we daven, when we make brachot, we are sort of defamiliarizing ourselves with the world. Like, this apple isn't just an apple. It is borei pri ha'etz. It is sort of a way to acknowledge the God who created the fruit of the tree. And I think that like one of the points that Tolkien makes is that not everybody likes fairy stories. I would argue that also not everybody likes tefillah. And that what you end up doing is getting a different kind of shivim panim laTorah. Like, what are these 70 ways in which you can access this experience of the divine in nature, or sort of God's world coming into our world, and this sort of connection of the two, of understanding ourselves as living in a world that is extraordinary and sort of not in that weird space of sort of God created the heavens and the earth, and shamayim la'Hashem ba'aretz natan libnei adam, that like God gave us this earth and it's ours and it's also not ours. We also still owe God things. Like, all of these things come together and we access them in different ways. Tolkien, as somebody who doesn't daven regularly or make brachot, is arguing.
He probably does daven regularly.
He probably did daven regularly. That's fair. I just want to call it davening.
Or did he? I don't know.
He probably did.
Did he go through the daily prayer?
I think he probably did.
He may have gone through daily prayers. He definitely insisted, he did not like Vatican II and insisted on doing things in Latin, even after everyone else stopped. His children spoke about it being kind of annoying, where like everyone else would be responding quietly in English, and then you'd hear this like booming voice from the back of the church yelling in Latin, and they're like, yeah, that's our dad.
love it.
That's great. So obviously he had his own way of being in the world that is different from ours, and I think that what he's offering is, especially for those of us who sort of grew up on fairy stories and love fantasy, a way of understanding fantasy not just as like a side gig or a silly thing that takes time away from God, but itself a way of accessing God. He also talks about escape and distinguishes between sort of the flight of the deserter and the escape of the prisoner, that one is to be condemned, the other lauded. And when we are stuck, when we feel ourselves stuck, the idea of escaping is not a bad thing. It's not bad to want to escape from poverty and hunger and sadness and all of the horrible things in the world, in part for the purposes of recovery. That like we can come back again if we can leave it. But if you're dealing with the same thing day after day after day, it gets exhausting. And in some ways, kind of, Tanakh can do a similar thing for us. That like it invites a return to a world where God is manifest, where things are easier, where things are also more difficult in their own way. Like returning to Yetziat Mitzrayim twice a day gives you an opportunity to think about, okay, well, what does it mean to escape into this world where redemption is happening? And then come back here and live in a world where like it feels like we're still fighting that fight. What does it mean to do that over and over again? To like return and experience this and then come back to our world. And then there's one other thing that he says that fantasy is crucial for, and this is what he calls consolation. Where, of course, he invents a word because that's what philologists do. But the consolation of fairy stories has another aspect than the imaginative satisfaction of ancient desires. Far more important is the consolation of the happy ending. Almost, I would venture to assert that all complete fairy stories must have it. At least I would say that tragedy is the true form of drama, its highest function, but the opposite is true of fairy stories. Since we do not appear to possess a word that expresses this opposite, I will call it eucatastrophe. Oh, yeah. The eucatastrophic tale is the true form of the fairy tale and its highest function. So, the purpose of fairy stories, the consolation, is the happy ending, but not sort of in a bad sense. I can't think of a better way to put it. That what he was saying is, if we kind of go back to the Yosef story that we were talking about earlier, that turn, that moment where Yehuda approaches Yosef and argues for Benjamin's life and goes through it, and Yosef says, Ani Yosef ha'or avichai, and Yosef reveals himself to be who he is. That's the moment of eucatastrophe. The turn from what looks like certain doom into the extraordinary delight, the possibility of going forward, the joy. He thinks of that as like the key thing that fairy stories gives us is these moments of that turn, these moments of eucatastrophe, these moments of the ability to go from when things look at their worst to see that actually it's going to change. There's a possibility of hope. There's a possibility of something further. He says the consolation of fairy stories, the joy of the happy ending, or more correctly, of the good catastrophe, the sudden joyous turn, for there is no true end to any fairy tale. This joy, which is one of the things which fairy stories can produce supremely well, is not essentially escapist nor fugitive. In its fairy tale or otherworld setting, it is a sudden and miraculous grace, never to be counted on to recur. It does not deny the existence of discatastrophe, of sorrow or failure. The possibility of these is necessary to the joy of deliverance. It denies, in the face of much evidence, if you will, universal final defeat, and insofar as evangelium, giving a fleeting glimpse of joy, joy beyond the walls of the world, poignant as grief. It is the mark of a good fairy story, of the higher or more complete kind, that however wild its events, however fantastic or terrible the adventures, it can give to the child or man that hears it, when the turn comes, a catch of the breath, a beat and lifting of the heart, near to, or indeed accompanied by tears, as keen as that given by any form of literary art and having a peculiar quality. So that's what he thinks a good story does. And that's, I think, what he thinks, and says somewhat explicitly about sort of the Bible writ large, does for readers. It gives us those moments of eucatastrophe. It gives us those moments of joy. And in the moment of joy that we see in sort of fantasy and fairy stories and myth, it reminds us of true joy. It reminds us of either depending on where you're going to put your theological framework, connections to Hashem, Yetziat Mitzrayim, the coming of Mashiach, all of these things that are definitive and vital and crucial about the idea that like we won't be in exile forever. We will not suffer forever. We will not be here forever. It will not be terrible forever. Fantasy stories give us that access, give us that moment where we can reach it, and in some ways allow us to come back into a world where we haven't always reached it. It allows us to both see the little victories in the world and also imagine and continues to sort of kavel Hashem chazak v'ametz libecha v'kavel Hashem. Like hope, strengthen your heart, and continue to hope. Yeah?
It just, to me, it sounds exactly like Megillas Esther, and the fact that Purim is such a time of joy seems to epitomize the same thing.
Yeah, it's very much an Esther story of v'nahafochu. Like that is the eucatastrophe, the moment of flipping, of change, of shifting, the idea that everything at their worst, and then there's one thing that happens. And I think that we see that in actually both of the stories that we read on the first day of Rosh Hashanah. So I'm going to excerpt what Tolkien says at the end. At the end, he basically says, look, if you think it's cool that myth can do this, let me tell you about like the true myth. Let me tell you about the Bible. Because if you think it's cool that it exists in a secondary world, when you bring it into our world, in the primary world, it is so much better when it's real. And that's sort of where he leaves us. And that, I think, brings us to, feel free to grab a book if you want, or to share with people who are vaguely near you, make friends, if it's helpful to look. And I think that brings us to Torah reading and Haftarah reading on the first day of Rosh Hashanah. When we start to think about the story of Hagar getting sent into the desert, which feels itself like a catastrophe in the very traditional sense of the word. The idea of exile, the idea of having no one to turn to. That moment when Hagar walks away from Yishmael because she can't stand to hear him crying anymore. And she's like, at least let me not see it because that's all I can do. And that's at their lowest. Like that's the moment of catastrophe. And then you have the eucatastrophe, the angel who comes and says, I see you, and I will show you water. And I won't just show you sort of the immediate future, I will give you a promise of the future. I will tell you about the kind of man that your son is going to grow up to be. And he's going to be wild, and he's going to be able to handle all of these things that the world is going to throw at him. And that sense of you are not just going to be saved in the moment, but you are going to have a future. And that, I think, is the moment of eucatastrophe. And that's, I think, the thing that we need to hear on Rosh Hashanah. The idea that we're coming into a new year. It's the Yamim Noraim. It's really stressful. We're coming up to Yom Kippur. This question of, where are we? Are we facing catastrophes? Are things going to be okay? What if we feel like we're in the desert? What if we feel like we're bereft? Where are we and where do we go? And the answer that we get is sort of, look up because I will show you both your immediate future and a promise for the future. And I think what Tolkien and Lewis are both arguing is that if we read that story and just look at it for sort of darshaning the words and saying, well, this is meant to correspond to this, and this is meant to correspond to this, and we're meant to feel a certain way, rather than reading it and feeling it, we're kind of missing the point. That what we get as an offer from Torah reading is another way to access the things that we're trying to do with the piyutim and with davening and with connecting to Hashem. This is a story that does for us what kind of Unatana Tokef is also doing. It's taking us through the stress and the possibility of despair and defeat, and what Tolkien says is, like, understandably, the thing that we are most afraid of and most want to escape, which is death. And then it takes us through it, and it brings us to the other side, and it brings us to promise of the future. It brings us the promise of life. And that's what Hagar gets, and that's what we're supposed to get. If we can experience it, not just as a thing that we recite and hear read, but as a thing that we read and live, almost like a fantasy novel. If we can get into that headspace, then we can get out of it something kind of extraordinary. And then we're invited to do the same thing again, which I think is also really interesting, that we have these two stories that both invite eucatastrophe in the same way. Because then you get the story of Hannah, who is the beloved wife who has no children, and Penina has 10 sons, and Elkanah has no sympathy for her, and all she can do is go to the Mishkan and cry, because that's what she has. She is at her most devastating moment, and then what happens? She gets yelled at for it. She gets yelled at by Eli, the Kohen, and that is like the moment of catastrophe. You're at your worst, and the person who's supposed to help you comes over and tells you you're doing it wrong. Like, it doesn't get any worse than that. And then what happens? She explains herself, and she justifies herself. And in justifying herself to him, she then justifies herself to the entire world, and she is blessed with a son. She gets Shmuel. There's something that happens there. There's that moment of eucatastrophe where you expect, this is as bad as it's going to get. And then sort of her prayers are answered. And then she gets the thing she's praying for. And then she's invited into it. And it's a really complicated story, I think, for many people, especially because it's in a situation where there are people who have been waiting for that eucatastrophe, who've been dealing with infertility treatments, who can't get pregnant on their own, and for whom pregnancy is always sort of going to someone and saying, I need your help. And it's frustrating and degrading and hurtful. And it functions both as kind of a broader promise and also as a very particular moment of can I offer you this hope? Because it's a story that doesn't know. It's a story that is simultaneously trying to do all of the things. The giving of hope, the recognition that sometimes hope only exists in the story, but that if we can give hope in the story, maybe that's the thing that will allow it to come into the real world. And I feel like we're always kind of walking that precipice when it comes to stories, when it comes to Tanakh, that we're relying on it because it gives us a realness that doesn't always exist in our own experience. My Rosh Yeshiva, Rabbi Jeffrey Fox, has a Hanukkah shir that some of you will probably hear at some point about sort of the end of prophecy and the shift from knowing what God wants to needing to live in a world where we just have to kind of figure it out by ourselves. And it's with the growth of wisdom, Greek and otherwise, where we can access things by thinking about it and studying it and talking about it, which means we don't need prophecy anymore, but then also we don't have prophecy. We lose that surety. And I think that's kind of part of what happens when we read Tanakh is an attempt to recapture that little sense of surety, that little recovery, that moment of consolation, the idea of this is real, so that we can kind of step back into the real world and say, and find it there too. Find hope in all of its forms, in all of its sad, frustrating, however hard the job is after Yom Tov is over, and be able to kind of come back to it again and say, I had this moment of joy, I had this thing that allows me to go on. I went to this Tanakh, this book that I love, this book that is meaningful for me, not just because it tells me what to do, but because it gives me insight and it gives me feelings that I can take into the world and feel them, really feel them, and know what it is to love God, to hope in God, to believe, to do all of these things that sometimes in a rational world are not always easy to access. So when we can kind of jump into Tanakh and embrace it as a story, as a true myth, it gives us access to those feelings again, and then hopefully things that we can hold on to when we're outside of it, when we're going about our daily lives and not necessarily immersed. So that is my long argument for Tolkien and Lewis as people who can teach us, give us a frame with which to read Tanakh that I think can make us both better readers and also hopefully, I'm not going to say better people, but people who have access to feelings that we may not otherwise have access to, and emotions and experiences. And okay, great. 5 minutes, questioning. What do you got for me? Yeah?
I just wasn't sure if you said there were 3 things that you didn't have a quote for the third one, but was there a third one?
Oh yeah, the third is escape. That's sort of the flight of the deserter versus the escape of the prisoner is the second one. So it's recovery, escape, and consolation. And he deals with them separately, but he also wraps them all together as you need to recovery. How do you recover? You escape. What are you escaping from? All of the sort of death and despair of the world, because what we need is consolation. So he tells it kind of as that arc of a story. Yeah?
You just said, you're talking about prophecy, and too bad we don't have it anymore, so we have to do it by ourselves. But it occurs to me that, in fact, when we had it, we didn't listen to it anyway.
That's true.
So, what else?
Yeah, we have most of Nach reminding us that just because you have a direct access to the Word of God doesn't mean that anyone's going to pay attention. Yeah?
I'm saying I think that the eucatastrophe thing is really helpful because Tolkien's point isn't like a happy ending and they only happily ever after, but that there is a sudden turn from despair to joy. That doesn't mean the whole thing is joy, and I think a lot of Tanakh is like that. Like Yosef says Ha'od Avichai, there is reconciliation, but even at the end of the story, he has to remind them, and then the end of the story, and then the story has to continue with Pharaoh forgets Yosef.
Right.
Right. So this eucatastrophe sense of how the Tanakh stories come back, they have to have these moments where there is some finding of resolution, but it doesn't end like a Disney fairy tale anyway.
Right, that's good.
Yeah.
And so in the sense that that's how Tanakh has to keep going. I think is super helpful. I think with davening it's a little different because like with you talk about kind of Tokef.
Yeah.
In the middle, the Eucharistic return, it does happen, but there's the thing in the middle of Tshuva, Tefillah, it's tzedakah. There's something that you also have to do in the world besides experience the narrative, and that's where I think Tolkien is Jewish, and that there's grace. That while Jews have grace, the sort of sun beneficence that comes isn't always quite how Jews would see that happening in the real world.
Yeah, our relationship to Shayne, I think, is different than his relationship to like grace and a gift ungiven. And I think we do talk about like there's a reason that we have like the 13 midot, Hashem, Hashem, Kel, Rachum, Mechanun, Erech, Hapayim, Rav, Chesed, V'emet, like all of those things resonate but are different. And I think in part because the way we're expected to act in the world is different than the way that he thinks of acting in the world, which I also think has perhaps implications for the way that we think of stories as motivators as slightly different. And also that I think is still, I particularly like the way that you were framing eucatastrophe as like that moment of joy that in some ways allows us to go on, and is also the thing that allows the story to go on. And not to get all Tolkien-y, but like there is also a reason that that when he wrote the end of Lord of the Rings, it wasn't an entirely happy ending. Like, yes, as Frodo says, the world is saved, but not for me. And like, I think that's also always part of it. Yeah?
I think, well, I like that the truths that are being conveyed, it seems to be that they're like emotional truths.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like the part that's hard, which is I guess connected to the question I was asking before, is like sometimes I read a story and it's like super suspenseful, I'm into it, and then like another person will read the exact same story and it just doesn't speak to them. And so it's like it's difficult to figure out like how to convince, you can't convince people to feel things. That was in the C.S. Lewis point, but I think what's hard with this especially is like, if that's the case, not everyone's going to get into stories, specific stories. And like that's, I don't know, that seems difficult with religion. It's like nice, it's good, I think it's a good, I don't think we have a better way of getting the truth realistically, but it does feel hard. Not everyone's gonna be on the edge of their seat hearing the Yosef story.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're both sort of making a point that like Tolkien makes, which is that, of course, if we're narrative creatures, God would give us access to God through narrative. Of course, the gift that is Tanakh comes as a story because we are storytelling creatures. And not every story is going to resonate with every person. Like even Tolkien acknowledges that some people don't like fairy stories and that's okay. He says it like grudgingly, but he does acknowledge it. Lewis acknowledges it as well. He's like, these were the stories that I just wasn't into as a kid, and like that happens. And here were the stories that I needed. And here were the stories that other people needed. And here's why I needed fantasy instead of real stories. That like, it was real stories that let me down. It was stories that like, that boys having adventures at school is gonna be the most amazing thing ever. And then I had a horrible school experience. Like that was the story that let me down. I was never let down by a dragon, by discovering dragons weren't real. Like that's his sort of argument. I think in some ways that's kind of why we have so many stories. Like Judy Klitzner, who spoke yesterday, has this amazing book called Subversive Sequels, where kind of what she is doing is saying like all of these stories do something, and then there's another version of them that retells them and looks at them through different eyes and sees them differently. And like, why do we have multiple stories on the same theme that we work them? Because in sequels, they critique and comment on and have things to say about the original story. So like one book, probably not something to say to everybody. 24 books, decent chance that we'll get something for everyone. And even kind of the three stories that I think of as the structure for Rosh Hashanah, that like you have the Hagar story, you have the Chana story, and you have the Akedah. And like which of those eucatastrophes speak to you? In some ways, I'm like, I dafka didn't want to talk about the Akedah as eucatastrophe because I'm still uncomfortable with it, and I don't feel like unpacking all of my discomfort into a microphone in front of 20 people. Like that feels weird. And I think that like there are people for whom the Akedah is going to be the eucatastrophe that is definitive and speaks to them and meaningful. So I think like on the one hand, yes, whenever you offer sort of the idea of a story, it's going to speak to some people and not other people. And I think in part the possibility of multiple stories that do similar things and make the same point, and then like Shoftim and the ongoing rinse and repeat cycle of, and then we messed up, and then we were punished, and then we came back, and then we did it again, has a kind of, well, which of these speaks to you? In which of these stories do you see yourself and find yourself and feel these feelings? And I think the hope is that everyone feels it somewhere. And I also think that that you can't reach everybody with everything. there will be, at the end of the day, some people who just don't like stories, and they're going to find meaning in tefillah or in halacha. And I think that, or in poetry, Yeshayahu. I think that there are enough of us who really do find meaning in story that we have this like wide multiplicity that is an ongoing invitation to like, I'm not going to tell you what to feel. I'm going to give you these feelings in book form so that you can feel them and so that you can kind of come back to me with them. Thank you so much.